Now, historical methodology is advancing, and as I said earlier, that they were looking for linguistic rigor and other disciplines from where they could borrow, and this is the time we should not forget when in science discipline also many changes are taking place. In fact, science through experimentations in labs was moving towards a kind of positivism in scientific discipline. Therefore, history is not to be left far behind. So, the gentleman who will come to figure very prominently in this arena would be Leopold von Ranke. He was born in 1795 and died in 1886, which means you know a pretty long time, and he left behind a remarkable impact on historiography. In fact, even now in the 21st century, we can't say that he is no more relevant. He is still relevant and he is still being discussed, and in a very episodic manner. His theories would come up, um, with a regular interval, and people will be, negotiating with his arguments. So, German official historiography of the 19th century was by no means propagandist and had enormous achievements to its credit. The most preeminent historian of this school was Leopold von Ranke. Ranke did not start as a historian, he was a classicist, a scholar and teacher of Latin and Greek. He was made a teacher at some school at Frankfurt, GDR at that time. Feeling disgusted with the way history of Greece and Rome was taught during his time, he published in 1824 Geschichte der Romanisch und Germanisch Völker von 1494 bis 1514. Translation would be History of the Latin and Teutonic Nations from 1494 to 1514. In this book, he treats the struggle waged between French and the Habsburgs for Italy as the phase that ushered in the new era. The appended treatise Zur Kritik neuer Geschichtsschreiber, in which he showed that critical analysis of tradition is the historian's basic task. He should not be swayed by tradition. His more important work. Its appendix is particularly important. Appendix normally are relegated to the background of the book, but in his appendix you will find that the subject is still very relevant even if it has been relegated to the appendix. That's why I am quoting the appendix here to support that argument. So, appendix is particularly important about this book, and a statement in the introduction which he says, "My object is not to judge the past or to chart out lessons for the future." In other words, the historian's business is to relate the past as it was. If you remember my lecture on, facts, I had repeatedly told you that, he's saying, "Wer es eigentlich gewesen," means history as it was. That should be the, task of the historian. A historian can't afford to pass judgments on the past or to provide lessons for the future, which would mean that he is against any project of interpretation. In the appendix of his book, Ranke argued in favor of a very critical approach to source. It is not enough to establish the authenticity of a historical fact by arguing that the source referring to it are contemporary. The reliability of the source should not be established by the fact of its being contemporary alone or by the fact of some of its information being correct. It could be correct. The whole text should be examined in segments to determine how each set of facts were acquired. Hereby, sources eyewitnesses, all of which then ought to be critically scrutinized. It should not be accepted on face value. If you want to know the intrinsic value, you will have to go deeper into it. By going to the sources of the sources, so to say, Ranke proved how in several instances historical fallacies had been treated as facts of history simply because the historians had not bothered to make internal analysis of the sources. Insistence on the internal scrutiny of the sources, therefore, marks the framework of his history of 16th-18th century Europe. Ranke was the author of a large number of books. He wrote the voluminous The Secret of World History, running into several volumes, closing at the 11th century AD. In addition, he was the author of around 54 books on diverse topic and length. That's not a small feat, and they are original works, unlike, so they are absolutely original in their own right. His books on the history of popes, which runs into multiple volumes, 16th to 18th centuries, history of England in the 17th century, history of France during the same period, history of Germany during the 16th-18th centuries are very well-known works. They are classics in their own right. Though the themes are different, all these works appear uniform, meticulously following Ranke's rigorous approach towards sources. He established the cult of contemporaneity by insisting on the immediate sources closest to the event in terms of space and time as being the most reliable. That is the first criterion. To him, even contemporary chronicles are secondary sources, even if they are contemporary, for because they rely on the most part on past recollections and bazaar gossips. The only authentic documents are those written at the very moment or soon after, immediately after, such as official documents and proclamations, eyewitness accounts, text or text of treaties signed between two governments, etc. Even these and strictly, primary sources, insisted Ranke, should be thoroughly examined, even if they are official documents, especially for the linguistic accuracy of their interpretation. Every word, term must be interpreted in relation to what it meant at the time it was written down. You remember my lecture on Lorenzo. He was also doing the same thing. That kind of thing, he is emphasizing. He thus, for the first time, perhaps realized, not first time, but he's. I will consider him as next to Lorenzo, when he is realizing that words change meanings over a period of time, and recognize the importance of keeping this in mind while approaching the sources. The difference between Lorenzo and Ranke is that he was saying that vocabularies keep on changing their meanings, but some vocabularies might not have been known earlier, which also suggests by the internal examination that you can date the document on the basis of the words which are coming into use. He is going further away from it, and in that sense, he is the first, perhaps the first, who says that words change meanings over a period of time, and recognize the importance of keeping this in mind in approaching the sources. So, in other words, his emphasis is on contemporaneity in terms of the meaning or the use of the word and the context of the word in which it is used. So, Ranke's approach to history, while indeed made fresh breakthroughs by its very logic, it also at the same time considerably restricted the scope of history. So, there is no flight of imagination, he precludes that. If strictly primary sources are the only reliable sources, then the writing of history would obviously be confined to those spheres of human activities which would be illumined by these sources alone. So, there is no question of using contemporaries or other sources. In other words, the domain of history would become confined to a description of political and diplomatic events alone, and perhaps some study of law. Ranke also collected, as a part of his concern for primary sources, an enormous amount of inscriptions, because they are the contemporary in terms of time and space. And in 1850s, 60s, he published corpus of all inscriptions of the Roman Republican Empire, collecting almost all the relevant inscriptions anywhere in the world. Even the forgeries were discovered and printed to warn the researchers that one should avoid these pitfalls of using inscriptions, believing in the sanctity of the inscriptions. The most popular perhaps was his History of Roman Empire in 5 volumes. In this book, he sought to direct the politics of the Roman Republic by differentiating them into factions, seeking to relate them with their social roots. His investigative study of factions led him to postulate what is known as the theory of Caesarism. Which would mean when two classes are in conflict, a despot gets a chance to establish and consolidate his power by enforcing a compromise between the two conflicting parties. So, it is this ability to govern and control conflicting classes that explains the rise and success of Caesar, and that is why I have used the term Caesarism. He also made an effort to look at how government functions in practice at the regional as well as local reaches of society, as against an analysis of how it works theoretically through imperial fiats and the decrees of Caesar. Thus, the 5th volume deals with administration in the provinces of the Roman Empire so as to determine what he calls the ability to govern, how far they are the people in the periphery of the empire are following your dictates. So, Ranke's method and approach, especially the success with which he brought forth the contradictions of the society and critically studied the sources, was followed by subsequent historians. This is Ignaz Z. So, for example, much later, Ignaz Gozayer, an Hungarian academic in the 19th century, and Julius Wellhausen, a German Orientalist who wrote the history of Al-Tabri in the 20th century, applied his method, Ranke's method, with considerable success to study the Islamic polity. When he is writing the history of Arabs, then Wellhausen is looking at the various tribal factions and how those tribal what was their aspirations, and which he was for the first time responsible for bringing into the limelight, that it is not a monolith. There are many contradictions within it. After him, another gentleman who will come to our domain of historical method is obviously Karl Marx, born in 1818 and 83, and his friend Frederich Engels, 1820 to 1895. He outlived Marx, and he is the one who collected volume 2 and 3, the documents which was written by Marx. So, volume 1 of Capital only Marx could publish in his time. Both of these volumes are contributions of Engels. He collected the writings of Marx and preserved it for us to study. So, volume 2 and 3 are posthumous publications. Marx was the son of a Jewish lawyer who became a Christian when the Germans prohibited Jews from practicing their religion He belonged to Trier, 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 which before 1818 belonged to France. After 1818, it was captured by the Prussians. He studied at the Berlin University, wherefrom he obtained a doctorate in Greek philosophy. He was also a classicist like him, like Ranke. Quite early on, he became involved in the debate among the Hegelians and began to doubt the relationship between idea with idea and the primary ideas over matter. Dissatisfied with Hegelians, he set out to study economics, political philosophy, and other related subjects. He was also well versed in physical sciences, and this is evident in throughout, his writings. Especially if you read, the footnotes of his writings, you will find he's frequently referring to. Darwin was his favorite. With this very strong academic background, he went to combine his strong sympathies with the poor and the exploited ones with his own political philosophy. And here I would like to say that, underline this fact that he is, very, generally you will find he is very sympathetically disposed towards the deprived classes. He has that compassion for the, deprived people. It is not that he went from philosophy to revolution or vice versa, but these processes came to him independently and also simultaneously. His political activities led him to be exiled from, several countries, not one. Ultimately, he was to obtain asylum in UK. Henceforth, he took no active part in armed struggle or revolutionary activities and settled to serious academic pursuits. In collaboration with Engels, he wrote a book entitled German Ideology. This book was ultimately to be known as Dialectical Materialism, on which I will give you a detailed lecture. Through this, though this was not their term, it was dialectical because it accepted Hegel's philosophy. It is Hegel's contribution, Hegel's philosophy of dialectics, while it was materialistic in nature as it rejected the primacy of idea over matter. Primacy of idea over matter. They also established a communist league for which they wrote the Communist Manifesto, a very basic document published in 1840. Since then, it has been brought out in many, editions. In a sense, the manifesto is an abridgment of their views of history as they sought to interpret it through the philosophy of dialectical materialism. Subsequently, Marx began to involve himself on a comprehensive work called Capital, Das Kapital, which was on one hand a critique of classical political economy extending from Adam Smith to Ricardo, and on the other an attempt towards discovering what Marx calls the laws of motion in capitalist societies. What are the laws which moves capitalist societies? The first volume of Capital was published in 1867 in German language. The volume 2 and 3, they were published posthumously published by Engels. He also wrote essays on French Revolution, on the history of France from 1848 to 1877, and on Napoleon Bonaparte also. These essays supplement Capital in that, whereas in the latter the focus is on economics, in the former he studies the political history. It's a beautiful combination of, economics and political history. I must say that I must give credit to Marx for, having a very, very strict framework in which he is, thinking about a problem. And he is never ignoring or, even eclipsing the importance of any of these segments of history. He is giving them equal, importance and then tries to develop a theory. He also wrote a number of articles on India, They have been published from Moscow, called Future Results of British Rule in India, wherein he seeks to establish certain principles to study British colonial rule. Because his pet theory was that had there been no colonies, there would not have been market for the capitalist market, capitalist commodities. So there would have been fall in the rate of profit, which would have been very damaging for the capitalist system to survive if it continued to operate within its country of origin. So Engels wrote a tract entitled Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, in which he applied the method of Marx to study the primitive societies. Although most of his conclusions are now regarded obsolete, it is nevertheless extremely important in suggesting the application of Marxian principles to the study of primitive communities. He also wrote Peasant Wars in Germany, which applies class principles to the study of peasant wars of 1760s. So, agrarian sector he is approaching through this notion of history. Admittedly, their historical work was a part of their revolutionary activities, but their high regard for precision and accuracy and their scholarly inclination lend not just to their other writings, but even their propaganda pamphlets in an immense historical value to their work. It would indeed be very unjust to say that their philosophical formulations were a justification for their revolutionary activities. This is, very plebeian approach to say like that, to condemn his very foundational, explanations in a very summary manner. That is not, correct actually. The point of departure for Marx and Engels from the preceding and contemporary philosophy is that, I quote him, "It is not ideas that are primary, but matter." Thus, no in-depth historical interpretation is possible. According to them, no in-depth historical interpretation is possible without assigning to the material environment a central position in one's study. The material environment is predominantly determined by the organization of production. That is, by how production is organized, slave agriculture, feudal tenure, etc., which in turn is determined by the technology of production, what he calls means of production. Ever since man began to produce surplus and cross the stage of primitive communism, within quote, organization of production in all societies has contained specific forms of exploitation. This exploitation, which is characterized by the usurpation of the surplus by a select few through mediation of force, divides societies into classes. The class of the exploited and the exploiter. This exploitation is sustained not just by simple force, but significantly by the state, which, in fact, is the engine of class. Contrary to other historians and philosophers such as Hegel, Marx assigned an extremely negative, partly religious, which justified surrender to the exploiters and taught the exploited masses to accept exploitation as a part of destiny. That this is your fate, so you suffer. That kind of justification, Marx questions that. Thus, either consciously or unconsciously, religion tends to make people accept the system of exploitation. Religious is thus an opium of the masses, often very popularly heard about a phrase. But this, since exploitation is a real deprivation of, these structures aiming at sustaining exploitation don't work, and as an antithesis encourage the exploited to assume power and wealth, creating in the process their own organization of production and ideological superstructures to sustain it, by that to justify it. Thus, all history is the history of class struggle according to Marx and Engels. Although all through history, The division of classes in societies as also the nature of class struggle keep on changing. All because the mode of production and means of production, this interplay of the two will decide this. Also changing are the economic forces, patterns of exploitation and social production, all of which collectively was termed by Marx as the mode of production. He, in the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, used this term to signify a set of social and economic relationships which define a particular period of history as Asiatic, self-owning, capitalist, etc. Asiatic mode of production is the famous, expression. Engels in Origins of Family reduced quite simplistically the modes of production to primitive communism, slave owning state, serf owning state, and finally the capitalist mode of production. Changes in the mode of production, according to Marx, occur owing to the development of technology, for it is the development of technology that not only change the productive forces, but also as a natural corollary, the nature of exploitation, that also changes. Thus, if feudal exploitation arose by exploitation of labor, capitalist exploitation arose by the usurpation of the surplus value of labor. These changes also affect ideologies, which have conventionally been understood as superstructure. Though it must be known here that Marx has used this term only once. Marx could see that a large number of ideas could arrive only because of the capitalist system. Ideas of liberty, for example, equality, and even to some extent democracy would be inconceivable without the early industrial revolution. Material conditions, he argued, find their reflection in ideas, but when he says this, he does not mean that only one set of ideas can develop in any specific mode of production, or that an identical mode of production in two or more societies would encourage an identical structure of ideas. There is nothing like that. Not only does he says this explicitly, but one notices in his Capital a recognition of variations in economic and political thought in different capitalist countries. He gives the examples from there. By inverting Hegel, I deliberately use the word inverting Hegel, that is to say, by assigning material conditions primacy over ideas, he does not in any sense ignores the influence of ideas. He is not rejecting the role of ideas. Ideas are secondary, but that which is secondary is not necessarily divested of important role, and that in history there would indeed be occasions when ideas would seem to assume a primary role, according to Marx himself. Furthermore, ideas are not only determined but also determine material conditions. Thus, the early sprouts of capitalism made possible the vast amount of constitutional and liberal thought of the 18th century, finding perhaps its apex in Rousseau, and then it was this influence of his thought that caused the French Revolution, which in turn accelerated the development of capitalism. Moreover, in 1789, it could be urged that ideas held primacy, though indeed the background to these ideas lay in material conditions. In normal textbooks, whenever we discuss the factors behind French Revolution, one is intellectual reasons assigned, and in that they say that normally in the textbook things they say that it was due to Montesquieu's theory of separation of power and Rousseau and others, which led to French Revolution. This is the normal thing, but Marx is taking that into account, and he's saying that no, ideas did play a role, major role, but it did not play the primary role. So these ideas behind them lay the material condition. Those ideas, after all, how those ideas emerge, what led to the emergence of those ideas. So he is saying that it is the material conditions which precede and which give rise to such ideas. So it is not, it is the reverse of that. It is in this context that Marx says ideas become a material force when they have gripped the masses.